In the shadows of history, there exists a realm of records the world was never meant to see. Files buried beneath layers of secrecy, destroyed by governments, or simply lost in the chaos of war. From the icy forests of Eastern Europe to the secret laboratories of Britain, from Soviet archives hidden deep beneath Moscow streets to the ruined landscapes of Manchuria, these documents reveal a darker side of the Second World War. They are not just tales of battles won and lost, but stories of human ambition twisted into cruelty, of political maneuvering that sacrificed thousands for secrecy, and of the machinery of death operating behind closed doors. In these hidden files, we encounter operations deliberately erased, experiments that defy moral comprehension, and pacts whose betrayal shaped the fate of nations. Historians and intelligence agencies alike have struggled to piece together these fragments, encountering shredded papers, burned ledgers, and carbon copies smuggled across borders, each hinting at atrocities carefully designed to vanish from collective memory. What emerges is a world where information was a weapon, where truth was buried under propaganda and classified stamps, and where the shadows of these decisions still ripple through time. These lost files challenge the very narratives of victory and justice, revealing the suppressed stories of those whose suffering was never meant to be recorded. This journey into hidden archives uncovers not only what was done, but what was hidden. A stark reminder that the true cost of war is often written in silence and secrecy, waiting for decades to be rediscovered. The darkness is not simply of battlefields, but of the choices erased from history, choices that haunt the pages of the world's forgotten archives and beckon us to witness what was nearly erased from memory forever. Chapter 1: The Vanished Orders of Operation Iron Wolf. In the winter months of 1944, as snow blanketed the war-torn regions of Eastern Europe, Wehrmacht dispatches began referencing an operation cloaked in obscurity, known only by the codename Operation Iron Wolf. These orders, traced through intercepted communications and fragmented field reports, outlined a scorched earth strategy designed to disrupt Soviet advances and annihilate partisan resistance in occupied Poland. The directive, originating from the highest echelons of the SS Sicherheitsdienst and Abwehr Section 2, mandated the systematic liquidation of villages, the forced displacement of civilians into labor convoys, and the destruction of infrastructure critical to resistance operations. Weathered maps, annotated in precise Germanic script and stamped with the wolf insignia, reveal designated zones for these operations, yet the central files, known internally as Gestapo File No. 17B, were deliberately destroyed as Berlin teetered on collapse in April 1945. Only fragments survived: officer testimonies, partial convoy logs, and a handful of Soviet intelligence notes, classified until 1972, each hinting at the chilling extent of the campaign. The operation's initial phase targeted villages along the Vistula and Bug rivers, locations identified for their strategic proximity to partisan supply routes. Eyewitness reports describe column formations of SS troops moving through dense forests, their boots crunching over frozen ground as torches illuminated night raids. Civilians were gathered into the center of villages under guard, their identities cross-checked against lists confiscated from local administrative offices. Archival photographs, partially charred but miraculously preserved, depict skeletal remains of houses and burned livestock pens, a grim testament to the operation's intent not merely to suppress, but to erase entire communities. Radio intercepts recovered by Soviet agents in Lviv reveal meticulous planning, including timetables for civilian roundups, deployment of mobile killing units, and coordination with Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights designed to preempt partisan escape. The operation's codename, Iron Wolf, was emblematic of its calculated ferocity, a wolf hunting silently, methodically, leaving no trace. Survivor testimonies collected decades later describe a landscape of silent devastation. Villagers recalled hearing low murmurs of orders, punctuated by bursts of gunfire, while others remembered the eerie presence of German officers marking homes with chalk symbols, signaling which structures were to be spared and which obliterated. Captured German officers, interrogated by Soviet military intelligence, spoke in hushed tones of the operation's dual purpose: counterinsurgency and psychological warfare aimed at breaking the will of the local population. Intelligence cables indicate that any officer who questioned the moral implications of Iron Wolf faced immediate reassignment to the front lines or disciplinary action. These details, painstakingly cross-referenced with surviving Wehrmacht logs, reveal the human cost of bureaucracy executed with chilling efficiency. The logistical backbone of Iron Wolf was as brutal as its tactical objectives. Forced labor convoys, consisting of men, women, and children, were marched through sub-zero temperatures toward makeshift camps. Sparse rations and exposure to the elements ensured mortality rates were high, even before the forced internment began. Documents recovered from the Soviet counterintelligence archives, marked top secret, classified until 1972. Detail arrangements for transport by both truck and rail, revealing that the operation's architects anticipated attrition, but viewed it as an acceptable consequence in the pursuit of strategic objectives. The files also indicate a disturbing coordination with local collaborators, who were coerced or bribed to provide intelligence on partisan movements, supply caches, and the location of hidden civilians. Each betrayal compounded the isolation and vulnerability of targeted communities. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Operation Iron Wolf is the deliberate obliteration of evidence. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin, orders were issued to burn entire barracks of documentation, shred surviving ledgers, and erase coded transmissions from encryption devices. What remained were fragments, often discovered years later in the detritus of abandoned offices, attesting to the meticulous intent behind their destruction. Soviet intelligence archives hold intercepted Enigma decrypts that reference movements of units tasked with burning villages and executing prisoners, though the messages are fragmented and lack full context. Scholars piecing together these remnants have concluded that Iron Wolf was not merely a tactical operation but a prototype for the psychological and population control strategies that would later inform Cold War-era military planning. Testimonies from captured SS and Wehrmacht officers reveal a dissonance between the operation's stated military necessity and the visible human suffering it caused. One officer, whose interrogation files are now part of a declassified Soviet dossier, describes standing on a frozen hillside as columns of civilians marched past, noting the haunting silence broken only by the crackle of burning homes. Another officer documented in handwritten notes the deployment of flamethrowers in the forests surrounding key villages, intended to flush out partisans, but ultimately consuming entire clusters of homesteads. The physical traces of these events, burned foundations, skeletal remains, scorched farmland, survived long after the perpetrators themselves had vanished into the chaos of retreating forces and obliterated records. Cross-referencing Soviet archives, German field reports, and eyewitness accounts paints a complex picture of Iron Wolf's execution. The operation was structured in phased waves, each assigned a numeric designation correlating to targeted villages, with a rotating command hierarchy to ensure plausible deniability. Clandestine communications reveal a calculated effort to conceal the operation's scope from both German high command and Allied intelligence, suggesting that even within the Nazi apparatus, Iron Wolf was recognized as morally and strategically contentious. As a result, the remnants discovered decades later are fragmented and difficult to reconcile, leaving researchers to reconstruct intent through a mosaic of partially destroyed evidence, survivor interviews, and secondary intelligence reports. The legacy of Iron Wolf extends beyond the immediate human toll. Analysis of surviving documents indicates that the operation's methodology, rapid village clearance, forced civilian displacement, psychological intimidation, and systematic evidence destruction, served as a model for subsequent covert operations during the early Cold War. Western intelligence analysts reviewing Soviet intercepted communications noted the tactical parallels in post-war counterinsurgency programs, raising unsettling questions about how knowledge of atrocities may have influenced strategies long after the war ended. The archival fragments, annotated with officer signatures, cryptic symbols, and operational codes, underscore the meticulous, almost clinical approach taken by those who orchestrated the campaign. Each recovered piece serves as a reminder of a deliberate effort to engineer both physical and historical erasure. Even in contemporary assessments, the emotional gravity of Operation Iron Wolf is palpable. Visits to surviving villages reveal ghostly remnants of walls, fences, and stone foundations, often accompanied by memorials erected decades later. Oral histories continue to describe the sensory details, the metallic scent of smoke, the distant echo of gunfire, and the oppressive cold that seemed to amplify the terror of those nights. Researchers compiling these narratives have noted recurring visual motifs: smoke rising through snowy forests, wolves etched into maps, and abandoned carts frozen in mid-motion, symbolic traces of an operation designed to leave no living witnesses and no record, yet whose echoes cannot be entirely erased. The interplay of meticulous planning, human suffering, and intentional obliteration of evidence cements Operation Iron Wolf as a hidden chapter of the Second World War, one whose files were almost entirely annihilated, but whose legacy of terror remains written into the landscape and memory of Eastern Europe. The surviving records, once thought to be mere fragments, have enabled historians and analysts to reconstruct a chronological narrative of the operation. By cross-referencing Enigma decrypts, surviving officer diaries, and Soviet intelligence notes, it has become clear that Iron Wolf spanned several months, with targeted waves occurring in November and December of 1944. Each phase was meticulously timed with weather conditions and the anticipated movement of Soviet forces, suggesting a high degree of operational coordination that extended beyond the immediate tactical objectives. The integration of reconnaissance flights, infantry patrols, and local informants reveals a methodical approach to erasure, not only of resistance infrastructure, but of the communities themselves. While the central Gestapo files were destroyed, these peripheral records collectively paint a harrowing picture of a calculated campaign against human life and memory. The psychological imprint of the operation on survivors was profound. Accounts describe the lingering fear and mistrust that pervaded liberated areas, the silence that followed as communities struggled to rebuild amidst the remnants of charred villages and abandoned corpses. Chapter 2: Britain's Forbidden Biochemical Experiments at Porton. In the shadow of global conflict, Britain's secret scientific endeavours at Porton Down Laboratories were shrouded in layers of secrecy so dense that even decades later, the full scope remains partially obscured. Beginning in 1942, under the cover of defensive research, British military scientists undertook a series of experiments with chemical and biological agents designed not only to prepare for potential enemy attacks but to exploit weaknesses in Axis food, supplies and civilian infrastructure. The program, internally referred to as Operation Vegetarian, involved the development of anthrax-laced munitions intended for targeted livestock herds in Nazi-occupied Europe. Test islands, such as Gruinard in Scotland, became infamous as permanent contamination zones. The terrain, barren and windswept, was marked with steel fencing, warning signs, and isolated bunkers where scientists in protective gear meticulously prepared spores, unaware or indifferent to the long-term environmental impact. Archival correspondence between the War Office and Winston Churchill's inner circle details contingency plans for strategic civilian starvation, revealing a calculated willingness to manipulate ecological and human vulnerabilities as instruments of war. The laboratory itself was an imposing, sterile structure where the air hummed with a quiet tension and floors were polished to a reflective sheen, masking the horrors conducted within. Researchers in white lab coats worked with surgical precision, handling vials of pathogens with mechanical detachment. Daily logs describe experiments exposing sheep and cattle to virulent strains of Bacillus anthracis, with meticulously recorded outcomes. Some animals were monitored for days until collapse, their deaths serving as both proof of concept and a warning of the potential devastation if deployed on Axis-controlled agricultural regions. The secrecy surrounding these experiments was absolute. Test results were classified under multiple security layers, and the very existence of Operation Vegetarian was omitted from post-war records, sealed under the Official Secrets Act. Only decades later did fragments resurface in national archives, redacted, but telling a story of calculated biological warfare. Documents recovered from Porton Down reveal intricate planning for deployment. Aircraft modified to carry anthrax-laden feed were mapped for flight paths over German farmland, each route carefully calculated to avoid Allied air patrols. Supplies were stockpiled in reinforced depots, and communications between the Ministry of Agriculture and War Office indicate a tight coordination with logistical officers who would have overseen the dissemination of these biological weapons. The meticulous attention to detail extended even to the labeling of vials, temperature control for spore viability, and protocols for potential accidents. Despite the ostensibly defensive rationale, internal correspondence hints at moral discomfort among some scientists, their objections buried under layers of bureaucratic approval and wartime urgency. Gruenar Island, one of the most infamous test sites, offers a stark testament to the enduring consequences of these experiments. Isolated in the North Sea, the island was stripped of vegetation, and steel bunkers lined its rocky shores. Reports from soldiers stationed there decades later describe a haunting landscape. Winds whipping over barren cliffs, the scent of chemical agents faint but persistent, and the sense of a place untouched by human habitation, yet forever scarred by human hands. Soil samples taken in the 1980s still revealed residual contamination, a grim reminder of the permanent impact of wartime experimentation. Eyewitness accounts describe the methodical procedure of releasing anthrax spores into feed, observing livestock mortality, and recording data with clinical detachment. The experiments were not limited to livestock. Small-scale trials involved simulated human exposure, often on volunteers who were inadequately informed of the risks. These trials, documented in secret memoranda, suggest a willingness to compromise ethical standards in pursuit of strategic advantage. The secrecy extended beyond the laboratories. Documents purged from Ministry of Defense records show intentional destruction of sensitive files as the war concluded, ensuring that even internal audits could not trace the full scale of Operation Vegetarian. Historians attempting to reconstruct events rely on fragmented reports, partially redacted letters, and the accounts of scientists who, decades later, described the moral ambiguity of their work. Some personnel recounted that protective measures were deliberately inconsistent, leaving room for plausible deniability in case of public exposure. The psychological toll on staff was profound. Many described persistent anxiety, nightmares, and guilt over the knowledge that their experiments, if ever deployed, could devastate civilian populations in ways conventional bombing could not. The intersection of science and military strategy at Porton Down illuminates the duality of innovation during wartime. On one hand, the laboratory was a hub of precision, methodology, and technical achievement. On the other, it functioned as a crucible for ethically questionable decisions and long-lasting environmental damage. Memoranda discuss the potential consequences of anthrax contamination spreading to neutral territories, but these considerations were secondary to the urgency of wartime objectives. Communications between laboratory directors and War Office officials reveal a cold calculus. If enemy populations starved as a result of livestock losses, the strategic advantage outweighed moral considerations. These exchanges, preserved in fragmentary archives, reflect a tension between the ideals of scientific discovery and the imperatives of total war. Further insight is gained from the post-war treatment of Porton Down personnel and facilities. Some scientists were quietly reassigned to civilian research projects, while others continued work under newly classified programs aligned with Cold War priorities. Efforts were made to sanitize historical records. Files were purged, experiments unmentioned in official histories, and surviving documentation restricted to highly secure vaults. Only leaks, personal diaries, and investigative journalism decades later began to expose the breadth and moral complexity of these operations. The juxtaposition of clinical procedural language with the human consequences of the work demonstrates the deliberate distance maintained between scientific record-keeping and ethical accountability. Visual and sensory details from archival photographs and surviving notes bring the operations into sharp relief. Images depict steel bunkers, wind-blasted test fields, and figures in heavy protective clothing, their faces obscured by gas masks and goggles, moving with a choreographed precision across a stark landscape. Detailed maps annotate experimental zones, with notations indicating spore release points, wind direction, and livestock tracking. Diaries of laboratory technicians recount the eerie quiet of the island, broken only by the mechanical hum of ventilation systems and the occasional low murmur of supervising officers. Recurrent motifs include isolation, sterility, and the pervasive presence of hazard signs warning of lethal contamination, all underscoring the unnatural intersection of science and warfare. The implications of Operation Vegetarian extended far beyond the immediate war years. Contamination zones remained hazardous for decades, requiring extensive decontamination efforts and long-term environmental monitoring. Survivors of experimental exposure, volunteers and personnel alike, often suffered chronic illnesses, a lingering testament to the ethical compromises made in the name of strategic advantage. Declassified correspondence suggests that some of the most sensitive research, particularly related to aerosolized delivery systems and cross-species pathogenicity was purposefully withheld from public scrutiny. Analysts speculate that knowledge gained at Porton Down informed early Cold War biological defense and offensive strategies, cementing the laboratory's controversial legacy in both wartime and post-war intelligence operations. The narrative of Britain's biochemical experiments is not simply a tale of scientific ambition or strategic necessity. It is a story of moral compromise, secrecy, and enduring consequences. The interplay between meticulous planning, environmental devastation, and human suffering paints a complex portrait of wartime decision-making at the intersection of science and military objectives. Archival fragments, photographs, and declassified memos together construct a chilling testimony to the lengths nations will go to in pursuit of security and dominance, leaving a permanent imprint on landscapes, human health, and historical memory. Porton Down stands as a monument not to victory, but to the shadowed corridors of clandestine research, a stark reminder that knowledge, when wielded without conscience, can transform even the most sophisticated laboratories into instruments of profound human and environmental suffering. The enduring legacy of Porton Down continues to challenge historians and ethicists alike. While public awareness has grown, the full scope of the experiments, the identities of those involved, and the extent of environmental and human consequences remain partially obscured. Declassified letters hint at higher-level awareness, including communications between Churchill and the War Cabinet, suggesting an intimate understanding of the moral and ecological risks inherent in the project. Attempts to reconcile scientific achievement with ethical responsibility are complicated by the strategic secrecy surrounding the files. Chapter 3: Stalin's Lost Pact of Betrayal and Silence. In the vaults of Soviet history, beneath layers of classified documents and destroyed archives, there lies evidence of clandestine agreements between Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler that extend far beyond the publicly acknowledged Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939. While the Pact's division of Poland into spheres of influence is widely known, newly declassified intelligence files and partially recovered NKVD ledgers suggest the existence of secret clauses specifically designed for mutual intelligence sharing against underground resistance networks. The documents, often fragmented and water-damaged, indicate that Soviet and German operatives coordinated surveillance and suppression of Polish officers, intellectuals, and insurgent cells, many of whom were later executed in mass atrocities such as the Katyn massacre. These agreements were meticulously kept off official records. High-ranking Soviet officials later admitted that the existence of these secret arrangements was considered too politically damaging to preserve. In the chaos of Operation Barbarossa, as Hitler's forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin issued orders to destroy the incriminating documents, ensuring that the pacts would survive only in smuggled carbon copies and sporadic intelligence reports obtained by Western agencies. The operational details revealed in surviving NKVD reports suggest an alarming level of coordination. Soviet agents were instructed to provide Germany with dossiers on Polish resistance fighters, including names, addresses, and familial connections. In return, German Abwehr units supplied intelligence on Soviet sympathizers within the territories annexed in 1939. Communications between the two powers describe clandestine couriers crossing borders at night, maps annotated with safe routes, and the covert transmission of microfilm containing sensitive data. Many of these reports were marked top secret, destroy after reading, a directive that ensured the eventual near-total erasure of evidence. Despite the obliteration, fragments found decades later by historians allow a reconstruction of the agreement's broader purpose, suppressing resistance movements while securing political leverage over occupied territories. These operations, carried out in forests, villages, and city streets, involved both surveillance and violent suppression, with outcomes meticulously recorded in NKVD files that were later smuggled to Western intelligence after Stalin's purge campaigns. The human cost of the pact was staggering. Thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and community leaders were arrested, deported, or executed. Archival evidence shows that Soviet authorities coordinated the transportation of prisoners to camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan, while German forces simultaneously rounded up individuals in Western Poland, often executing them to prevent resistance or intelligence leaks. Testimonies collected from surviving family members decades later describe the psychological terror of families torn apart, the sudden disappearances of fathers and brothers, and the chilling efficiency with which entire communities were neutralized. Local archives contain fragments of letters smuggled out by prisoners, their ink smudged and pages torn, recounting interrogation tactics, the names of NKVD interrogators, and the confusion bred by overlapping German and Soviet operations. These human narratives, juxtaposed with official intelligence reports, paint a stark picture of coordinated betrayal and the bureaucratic machinery of state-sanctioned erasure. Even the logistics of information exchange reveal meticulous planning. Carbon copies of operational lists, often smuggled in briefcases or sewn into coats, were circulated between Soviet and German intelligence. Instructions detailed precise timelines for arrests and surveillance, ensuring that partisan networks could be neutralized almost simultaneously from both sides. This synchronization reduced the likelihood of resistance escape and minimized errors that could alert civilians or neutral observers. The surviving fragments of these plans reveal a world where trust was calculated, betrayal institutionalized, and the machinery of oppression operated under a cold, bureaucratic logic. Some intercepted German communications, later found in British and American intelligence archives, corroborate these details, showing that Western analysts were aware of secret coordination, even as Stalin's regime denied all claims of collusion. Stalin's destruction of incriminating documents after June 1941 was systematic. Instructions for incinerating sensitive files were issued to NKVD regional offices, with supervisors reporting back on compliance. Reports indicate that entire floors of archival material were burned in Moscow basements, while additional copies were crushed or dumped into rivers. The purpose was clear. Any evidence of early collaboration with Nazi Germany would have undermined the Soviet moral and political position, both domestically and internationally. Yet some copies survived, hidden by defectors, sympathetic clerks, or overlooked due to bureaucratic oversight. These fragments, when later cross-referenced with intercepted German records, allowed historians to piece together the covert intelligence-sharing operations, including lists of targeted officers, encrypted communications, and the scheduling of coordinated raids. The Pact's implications extended far beyond Poland. By providing mutual intelligence, Stalin and Hitler gained a strategic advantage over resistance movements in Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine. Records indicate that NKVD and Gestapo units met in secret locations, exchanged field reports, and coordinated the deployment of special units tasked with capturing or eliminating key insurgents. Surveillance techniques included covert photography, coded telegrams, and infiltration of underground networks using double agents. Diaries from captured operatives reveal the constant anxiety of working within these networks, unsure which orders were genuine and which were traps. Such operational secrecy created an environment of paranoia, where even loyal agents could be accused of treason, arrested, and executed, further demonstrating the human cost of intelligence operations coordinated at the highest levels of two totalitarian regimes. Beyond the immediate human toll, the Lost Pact had long-term geopolitical consequences. The destruction of evidence allowed both powers to craft post-war narratives positioning themselves as victims or liberators, erasing uncomfortable truths about initial cooperation. Western intelligence agencies, upon reviewing recovered fragments decades later, recognized the extent of early collusion and its impact on resistance movements. Yet political considerations during the Cold War prevented full public disclosure. Scholars analyzing these documents today must navigate partial records, smuggled copies, and fragmented testimonies, balancing the need for historical accuracy against the challenges of incomplete archives. The narrative that emerges is one of strategic calculation, betrayal, and meticulous efforts to suppress any trace of complicity, highlighting the interplay between power, secrecy, and historical memory. Visual motifs from surviving archives underscore the chilling nature of these operations. Maps marked with crosshairs on towns, telegrams typed on aging machinery with red annotations in Cyrillic, and photographs of NKVD officers and Abwehr agents in stiff, formal poses. Correspondence between the two regimes' officers frequently includes codenames, encrypted notations, and operational charts detailing the timing of arrests and surveillance. Some surviving carbon copies bear scorch marks, water stains, and handwritten corrections, a testament to the frailty of historical memory and the deliberate efforts to erase inconvenient truths. Eyewitness accounts from villages targeted under these coordinated operations describe a world of sudden disappearances, shadowed patrols, and an omnipresent fear that each knock at the door could signal the end. These details combine to evoke a grim tableau of betrayal, orchestrated at the highest levels of government, operating quietly beneath the surface of recorded history. The discovery of these hidden agreements challenges the conventional understanding of World War II. Rather than a simple narrative of opposing forces, the evidence reveals complex layers of collaboration, betrayal, and moral ambiguity. The destruction of official records ensured that many participants remained unaccountable, and the surviving evidence, fragmented and obscured, continues to be scrutinized by historians seeking to understand the full extent of Soviet-German intelligence coordination. By analyzing carbon copies, smuggled reports, and partial NKVD ledgers, researchers can reconstruct not only the operational mechanics, but also the human consequences of these secret agreements, revealing a war waged not only with guns and tanks, but with information, deception, and calculated betrayal. The story of Stalin's lost pact remains a cautionary tale about the impermanence of recorded history, the fragility of trust, and the lengths to which powerful regimes will go to conceal morally and politically inconvenient truths. The surviving fragments, though incomplete, expose the convergence of intelligence, strategy, and human suffering, offering a rare glimpse into a shadowy chapter of the war that was deliberately obscured. Each piece, whether a scorched ledger, a handwritten note, or a defector's testimony, serves as a haunting reminder that history can be manipulated, erased, and rewritten, but cannot fully obliterate the lived realities of those caught within its machinations. Chapter 4: Unit 731's Atrocities and the American Bargain. In the shattered ruins of Manchuria at the close of the Second World War, American and Soviet forces encountered evidence of a program so harrowing that its full scope remained classified for decades. Unit 731, the Japanese Army's covert biological and chemical warfare division, had transformed the landscape into a laboratory of human suffering. Under the direction of General Shiro Ishii, the unit conducted experiments on prisoners of war, Chinese civilians, and even some Russian captives, subjecting them to vivisection, frostbite endurance tests, and weaponized plague exposure. The facility in Pingfang, near Harbin, consisted of sterilized concrete buildings, underground chambers, and open-air testing grounds where thousands of victims were systematically catalogued, often under codenames like Maruta, to depersonalize human subjects. Detailed logbooks recorded every experimental procedure, the exact dosages of pathogens, the physiological responses of each prisoner, and the fatal outcomes with clinical detachment. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, antiseptics, and the lingering presence of chemical agents, creating a landscape that was simultaneously sterile and gruesomely alive with human suffering. When American occupation forces moved into the region, intelligence officers quickly recognized the strategic potential of Unit 731's records. Rather than allow the full truth to emerge at war crimes tribunals, US authorities struck a controversial bargain with General Ishii and his staff, granting immunity in exchange for detailed research on biological warfare. Memoranda between General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters and the War Department in Washington, declassified decades later, reveal instructions to preserve the documents and prevent their use in public prosecution. Soviet investigators attempted to expose the atrocities, including detailed accounts of vivisection without anesthesia, lethal frostbite tests, and plague injections. Yet the American acquisition of the files ensured that much of the evidence remained hidden. The arrangement prioritized knowledge over justice, reflecting a post-war calculus driven by emerging Cold War tensions rather than moral accountability. The operations of Unit 731 were executed with the precision of a military campaign. Victims were transported under guard to test facilities, stripped of their identities, and assigned serial numbers. Experimentation included injecting pathogens directly into the bloodstream, exposing individuals to chemical agents, and monitoring the effects of extreme temperatures on tissue viability. Detailed records note the daily observations of symptoms, progression of disease, and eventual death, meticulously catalogued to assess the efficacy of biological weapons. The scale of these operations is difficult to comprehend. Thousands of lives were measured as data points, each entry a clinical testament to systematic cruelty. Photographs from the era, smuggled out by survivors and later declassified, depict the skeletal remains of human subjects, meticulously labeled containers of organs, and the stark, sterilized interiors of laboratory facilities. The recurring motifs of clinical precision juxtaposed with profound human suffering dominate the surviving visual record, emphasizing the unnatural intersection of science and brutality. The American bargaining for access to these records extended beyond mere data collection. Scientists, intelligence officers, and military strategists were given comprehensive access to experimental protocols, charts, and case studies, enabling the United States to accelerate its own biological warfare research. Internal memoranda describe the transfer of microfilm, laboratory notes, and even live specimens, all acquired under strict confidentiality. Many files were classified as top secret and remained inaccessible to the public for decades, effectively erasing the accountability of Unit 731's leadership while preserving their knowledge for strategic exploitation. This deliberate concealment prevented the full prosecution of war crimes, allowing individuals responsible for systematic atrocities to avoid punishment entirely. The moral and legal implications of this decision remain a subject of historical debate, raising profound questions about the intersection of intelligence priorities and human rights. Eyewitness accounts from survivors, some of whom were forced to participate in or witness experiments, reveal the psychological and emotional toll of these operations. Prisoners describe the sterile, echoing corridors of the facility, punctuated by the screams of subjects undergoing procedures. The air was often humid, with the scent of chemicals, antiseptics, and the lingering odors of decay. Guards moved with mechanical precision, observing the subjects and ensuring compliance, while researchers documented every response, every visible sign of suffering, and every death with cold detachment. Diaries, smuggled notes, and post-war testimonies convey the atmosphere of fear and dehumanization, reinforcing the documentation that has survived in American intelligence archives. These accounts illustrate a persistent theme: the systematic dehumanization of human subjects. In the name of scientific and military advancement, operational details of Unit 731's experiments demonstrate a chilling intersection of strategy and methodical cruelty. Experiments were organized by disease type, environmental conditions, and exposure levels. For frostbite testing, prisoners were bound to metal frames and submerged in ice-cold water for extended periods, while organs and limbs were removed to study tissue damage. For plague and anthrax trials, clothing and bedding were treated with pathogens, exposing victims to infection and documenting the progression of disease. Victims were monitored for symptoms, with data meticulously logged and transmitted to higher command. Maps indicate the placement of field testing zones, decontamination protocols, and the routes used to transport prisoners from surrounding regions. These layers of organization reflect a systematic approach to human experimentation, emphasizing the strategic and operational mindset behind the atrocities. The physical remnants of Unit 731, long abandoned and partially destroyed, offer a haunting visual record of the program. Concrete bunkers, ventilation shafts, and open testing grounds remain, often filled with debris, rusting equipment, and faint traces of chemical residue. Photographs from post-war inspections reveal frozen test chambers, sterilized surgical tables, and instruments arranged for repeated experimentation. Recurrent motifs include the sterile precision of the laboratory juxtaposed with the chaos of human suffering, the echoing emptiness of abandoned corridors, and the omnipresent signs of meticulous record-keeping. Survivors and historians alike describe the atmosphere as simultaneously clinical and grotesque, a place where science was divorced from ethics and human life reduced to mere data. The American handling of Unit 731's materials ensured that public knowledge of these atrocities remained limited for decades. Internal reports describe the extensive cataloging of experimental data, secure storage of documentation, and selective dissemination to scientific and military personnel. Efforts were made to suppress evidence that could implicate the unit's leadership, a decision motivated by the strategic value of the research in the context of the emerging Cold War. Some records were intentionally misfiled or redacted, while others were classified under multiple layers of secrecy. Only after the 1980s did partial declassification begin to reveal the magnitude of the experiments, their methodology, and the deliberate concealment orchestrated by American authorities. Scholars and investigative journalists have since pieced together these fragmented records, revealing a grim narrative of human experimentation, bureaucratic complicity, and geopolitical calculation. The legacy of Unit 731 extends beyond the immediate human cost. The knowledge gained from these experiments influenced the development of biological defense programs, ethical debates surrounding human experimentation, and post-war intelligence practices. The survivors' testimonies, combined with archival evidence, offer a window into the systemic cruelty of a state-sanctioned scientific enterprise, revealing the extent to which morality was subordinated to military and strategic imperatives. The stark juxtaposition of precise record-keeping with profound human suffering serves as a reminder that scientific knowledge, when divorced from ethical oversight, can become an instrument of terror. Unit 731's atrocities, preserved and exploited under the American bargain, remain a haunting testament to the calculated intersection of war, science, and secrecy, a story whose shadows persist long after the physical remnants have faded. As the shadows of history recede, the hidden files unearthed from decades of secrecy reveal a reality both horrifying and meticulously concealed. These documents, fragments of Operation Iron Wolf, Porton Down experiments, Stalin's covert intelligence agreements, and the human atrocities of Unit 731, bear witness to the ruthless efficiency of war, bureaucratic cruelty, and moral compromise. Governments sought to erase these traces, destroying ledgers, burning reports, and suppressing testimonies, yet the remnants endure, whispering stories of suffering, betrayal, and deliberate erasure. Each recovered report, smuggled note, and charred photograph exposes calculated acts of violence, strategic deception, and the human cost of decisions designed to vanish from memory. The maps, coded directives, and laboratory logs tell of a world where civilians, prisoners, and even the natural environment became instruments of war, while intelligence agencies and military strategists exploited knowledge at the expense of justice. The haunting question remains: how many more atrocities were erased before they could be documented? And what truths lie forever hidden in lost archives? These files challenge our understanding of morality, authority, and historical memory, reminding us that secrecy can shape not only wartime outcomes but post-war narratives, power structures, and ethical boundaries. History, in its suppressed form, demands acknowledgement. It persists in whispers, fragments, and shadows, insisting that humanity bear witness to what was almost buried forever. The past is never truly gone. It lingers, encoded in charred pages, hidden memos, and the collective consciousness, awaiting discovery by those willing to confront the truths governments tried desperately to erase.